Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 55 on how to become the hero of Dominaria. Because this weekend we're going to play the Arena Open, which is going to be in Dominaria Sealed. Every single portion of it is going to be sealed, and every single portion of it is going to be Dominaria. You heard me right, Dominaria, not Dominaria United. We're going back 4 years to the set that was the last visit to the Dominaria plane that we had before Dominaria United. But before we go into it, I would like to thank mtgazone.com for sponsoring my seminars. I'm going to put out an article about Dominaria Sealed as well, and hopefully tomorrow it's going to be on MTGA Zone. There is already a very good article about the sealed format of Dominaria from J2S Josh. So please, by all means, go and visit, do some clicks, especially on my articles, because if I get clicks on my articles, they will think I'm actually useful. Bamboozle them, if you please. But okay, let's go back to the main topic. As I said, we're going to talk about Dominaria, and this is the set that is slightly different from the sets that we normally talk about because there is not so much data on it on 17 lands. You have to keep in mind that when Dominaria was first released, plain view, on mtgazone.com, there are a couple of articles. One from me will be released tomorrow, and there is one from J2S Josh, and it's basically a short primer on the Dominaria Sealed format. My article is going to be loosely related to what we're going to talk about during this seminar. So if you're interested in Dominaria Sealed, you don't have to go anywhere just yet. But on mtgazone.com, you will find articles from me and from J2S Josh and from a couple of other people that deal with limited. I do the data part. Josh does the punditry, and there's a couple of other people that contribute on occasions from the Draft Lab podcast. Right. So let's dive into it. But before, I always start with a preamble to my podcast, and this one is back to square one for me because I started playing Magic in 5th edition Weatherlight, and I played for several years until 2005, 2006, when I finally retired. I thought forever, but life had different plans for me. And then some years later, 13 years later to be precise, I sort of started slowly to think about Magic a bit more frequently than in the previous time. And I downloaded a couple of those apps that there were on the phone where you could play some kind of a poor man's version of Magic. I think that they were the trial runs for Arena. And then I saw that there was a possibility of getting on the beta test for Arena. And I did it. I got invited to it. I downloaded Arena. I started playing. And 3 days later, I was hooked. And 3 days after that, I decided, well, you know what? I'm playing on Arena already. I'm technically a Magic player again. Why shouldn't I go to a paper event? And I discovered that there is an LGS in the place I live, which was a bit of a surprise to me because I live in a pretty small place. But actually, there was an LGS, so I went there. There was a pre-release. I played in that pre-release. Humble brag, won it, and here I am 4 years later, creating content about Magic the Gathering. So, do I need to mention that the pre-release was for Dominaria? I don't think so. So the set, I have a nostalgic view of it. I don't remember much from the times when I played it first time. I remember much more when I reanalyzed it a couple of years later when I started playing on actual decent level. I do remember that in my pre-release, I was continuously afraid of mana burn. I notoriously tried to put damage on stack, and to the amusement of my fellow players. Also, when someone told me "is it," I had no idea what they're talking about. So yeah, it was rusty beginnings. Now I know all the "is it's" and "boroses." I know my Junt from my Jeskai. I managed to bridge those gaps that were created by 13 years of not playing. And I think that's going to be a sort of semi-nostalgic trip for me over this weekend to try to spike the open yet again. I had pretty mixed affair with opens. One of them, I went to the day two twice. Once I lost the second game, and that was not fun. And the second time, I forgot to log in time to subscribe for the second day. So technically, I was undefeated in that open, but alas, with no prizes. So maybe this weekend, it looks like the weather is going to be awful. I'm going to sit down and try to actually spike it. But yes, I am going to find it a bit nostalgic to go back to the Dominaria, even though I think that the set is lacking and it's been overshadowed by the sets that followed it, and it's not as good as some people try to make it to be. Still, we have to play it, and therefore, why not look into some data and see what makes it tick? So first of all, during Dominaria United, I said more than once that it was a set different from anything else in the recent years, because it was a set where all the color combinations and all the numbers of colors were pretty much playable. This is not the case in Dominaria. And I looked at the data that is available on 17lens.com. I looked at the percentage of decks according to how many colors they play. And in draft, it's predominantly a two-color set. Like 64% of the decks are straight two colors. Around 29% on top of that are two colors with maybe some small splash. And splashes, according to 17 lens statistics, it's 1 to 3 cards of the particular color with some sources that allow to cast it. And like only 6% of the decks are 3-color, and like 1% of the decks, maybe 1.5% of the decks are 3 colors in splash. And there's like almost non-existent decks with 4 colors and 5 colors. In Sealed, it looks slightly different, but it's probably not because the multicolor decks are better, but it's because it's hard to build a 2-color deck from this set, because one thing that is very typical of Dominaria is that there are a couple of good commons and they drop off very quickly. And if you don't get enough uncommons to fill your deck, you won't make it on playables to make a straightforward 2-color deck. But still, 45 decks managed to make it 2 colors. 37% of the decks are 2 colors and splash. Around 15% of the decks are 3 colors, and 3% have 3 colors and a splash. But this points me to the conclusion that probably where you want to be in this format is having a 2-color deck, if it's possible. And maybe make a small splash of a third color. If you're just short on playables, you can put some of the power. How does it relate to the win rate? And you can see with the same color scheme. So draft is blue and sealed is red. As you can see, the top win rates for both types of limited games are in 2-color decks. 62% win rate on average for the sealed. It has a very, very high win rate, by the way, the 17-lens sealed users, mainly because probably these are people that played Dominaria quite heavily and they came back and have a massive edge over people that didn't play. And 57% win rate in draft. And it drops off after that. So in draft especially, you see that it goes from 57 to 53 in 2 colors and a splash, to 51 in 3-color deck, 49 in 3 colors and splash. And then you have like very, very small sample sizes of the 4-color decks, so that shouldn't put too much worth in it. But there is still a further drop. In Sealed, it looks slightly better. You have 62% win rate of 2-color decks, around 60% win rate of 2-color decks with a splash. And then you see a slight drop off of 56, 60, 57, 55 of those 4-color decks. So if you can, try building 2-color decks, but make sure that you can. It's also interesting to maybe look whether Dominaria is a Prince or a Pauper format. And I always thought about how can I measure if something is a Prince or a Pauper. I decided to do it like this. I looked at the top 20 rares and mythics and their game in hand win rates, and I looked at the top 20 commons in the format and their game in hand win rate. Then I basically calculated it and calculated the difference between them. So obviously, hopefully at least, rares will have a higher win rate than the commons. And the bigger the difference, the more princely the format will be. At least that's how it works in my head. And I looked at the sets since Midnight Hunt up till Dominaria United, and I also looked at Dominaria Original. That's based on draft data as well. Just keep that in mind. And you can see that Midnight Hunt was the most popular set. The difference between top 20 rares and top 20 commons is only 4.1% game win rate. The most princely format was Crimson Vow, with a 7 percentage point difference between the rares and the commons. Dominaria positions itself like on the upper level of the popular set, so not much different from Midnight Hunt, but still a bit different. The difference is slightly bigger, but it's nowhere near the Crimson Vow level of princeliness. So this is a format when there is some strong rares, but they shouldn't be atrocious. Then I decided also to look at the trophy decks and look at how the sealed deck, trophy decks, key for no uncommons were not factored at all in this. I didn't want to make an additional metric and introduce it here. I'm going to look at it at some stage, how our uncommons looking. And I know that this particular set has at least 3 of those mythic uncommons that have an insane win rate. We're going to talk about it later. So I looked at the difference between sealed between all the sealed decks and sealed decks that trophied in this format. And what is the difference? Because I was expecting that since 2-color decks have slightly higher win rate, they will be a bit overrepresented in the trophy decks. So I looked at all the trophy decks from the recent sealed run of Dominaria, and turns out that indeed it's true. When all the decks that are played in the sealed in this format are 45% of 2-color decks, it's almost 53% of 2-color decks in the trophy pool. 2-colors and splash are close to each other, 37, 34%. But there is a big drop in 3-color decks. So 15% of 3-color decks in total, but only 10% of trophy decks are 3-color, and not much different in 3-color and splash. And this makes me think that indeed you need to be lucky to get this 2-color pool. Otherwise, if you need to build a proper 3-color deck, so more than 3 cards of the 3rd color, you are slightly disadvantaged, and your chances for trophying are slightly smaller. So there will be some luck factored into it. If you open a pool that allows you to build a streamlined 2-color deck, you are in a much better position than if you have a 3-color deck. And especially you have to think that probably in the later rounds of the Open, you will be likely to play 2-color decks. So think about that when you're building your 3-color deck, because you're forced to. What else? I looked at the popularity of colors in the trophy decks, and I looked at the main color and there's a color of a splash in each of the 5 colors. The most popular color played was white. Around 60% of the trophy decks had white in it as a main color. You can add additional 10% or so of decks that have white as a splash, and you total at around 70% of the decks have white, which means white is pretty strong. Then the second most popular color is black. Around 62% of the decks have black in some way or form. Third most popular color is blue. Around 50, maybe 54% of the decks have blue in some shape and form. You see that the number of splash is proportional to the number of main color play. So white is not only the most played color as a main color, but it's also most splashed color. Just a testament to the power of white cards in sealed format in this in Dominaria. And the same goes with black. This is the second most popular color, and it's also the second most popular splashed color. And blue is the third most popular color and the third most popular splashed color. Fourth color is green. Roughly 43% of the decks have green. Here, notably, green is not for splashing. Green is for playing as a main color. There's very few decks that splashed green because there's not so many cards that are comfortable in splashing in green. So if you play green, probably you should go more all in. And there's one color that is markedly behind everything else. That's red. Around 20% of the decks contain red as a main color. Maybe you add 7% on top of that from the splashing. Which means that if you want a trophy, probably you want to avoid red. I will show you later that not always is the case, but a general rule of the thumb is look at your white, blue, and black and hope for the bombs in those colors, or maybe green is also okay, but red is markedly worse than the other colors. You will see that when we look at the power of the cards linked to that. Trezio has a question, which is a good question, which is the reason why I'm going to highlight it for the YouTube people. Likelihood that red is so low because its success is predicated on very particular aggro builds that are much harder than sealed. That's one point. And there's also a second point. Red was also the hallmark of red-blue wizards tribal deck that you can draft, but you will very rarely get it in sealed. So I think off the top of my head, oh wait, why do we do it on top of my head? Off the top of my head when I can do it off the top of my actual data. But you will have to wait for a second before I find it. Yes, there we go. So if we look at the data from draft, clear up, is it? Okay, yeah. If we look at the data from draft, Izzet is around 25% of all the two-color decks in the format. 25%. So a quarter of two-color decks are Izzet. It's like huge overrepresentation. You have 10 color combinations, so you would expect 10% to be the average number. If you look at the sealed, Izzet is 6.7% of the two-color decks. So it's basically unplayable in the sealed because you need to get a pool that has both the wizards and the spells that enable it, preferably with the signpost uncommon for it, Adeline. Is it Adeline? Well, whatever. What's the name of the guy? You see, when the format is 4 years old, you might forget the name of the Adelise, I think. Yeah, that's the one. That's the name. So that's one of the main reasons why red is played less in sealed, because the strongest color combination with red in draft is absolutely not coming together in sealed. It will come together maybe once in the blue moon, but quite rarely. Okay, so that's for the question from Trezio. Okay. So let's start. There are 6 bombs, according to the sealed data from 17 lands, that are head and shoulders above anything else in the format. And that's specifically Siege Gang Commander, Varric's Bladewing, 2 red cards. I told you red is the weakest color. It does have the strongest bombs. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which will be known to anyone that played any constructed. It's still good in limited. It's absolutely unbeatable when you manage to defend it for a couple of turns, because you just overflow your opponents with card value, and you start getting closer to ultimating it. And there are other 3 bombs in Karn, Scion of Urza, another Planeswalker. Another thing that buries opponents in card advantage. Multani, Yavimaya Avatar, which is a 6-mana reach trample with the power and toughness equals to the number of lands. But also you can return 2 lands you control to your hand and return from your graveyard to your hand, which means that at some stage opponent will have to deal with a massive creature every single time. The fact that it has trample makes sure that they can't chump it. If they don't have any exile removal, they are in serious trouble. And Lyra Dawnbringer, which is a 5-mana 5/5 flying first strike lifelink and buffs your other angels, which don't think is anything that will matter in this format. But just the 5/5 with flying first strike and lifelink is going to win any kind of race realistically. So these are the 6 bombs that if you open them in your pool, you should think hard how to make sure that you can squeeze them in your deck. Yes, you can buff a Serra Angel. That's true. And yeah, Shalai is also an angel. So probably there are a couple of angels, but it's not like a massive plus. It's still upside, but I think that a 5/5 flyer lifelink would be probably enough. The first strike and the angel buff are additional tech. Not exactly trinket, but not the main qualities of the card. On top of that, there are 3 mythic uncommons, and these are the uncommons that have, in current sealed run, they have a game in hand win rate of around 70%, which is massive. But you have to think that the general win rate of the 17 lands users in this sealed format is quite high. And these are 2 auras, strangely, 2 legendary auras in Bolas Clutches, which basically for 6 mana steals a permanent from your opponent and makes it legendary, which sometimes actually can become quite useful. And on Serra's Wings, another legendary aura. This one enchants a creature, and it becomes legendary. Gets +1/+1, flying, vigilance, and lifelink. So basically, makes a pretty decent impression of the Lyra Dawnbringer, but on an uncommon level. We're going to get to Slimefoot soon. And you might be surprised, actually, in which section it will appear. Third one is Fight Fire with Fire. That's a red removal spell. For 3 mana, it deals 5 damage to target creature. But for additional 6, so 9 mana in total, including 2 red, it will deal 10 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets instead. And that means that the kicked version can target players and planeswalkers, except for only creatures. And this card usually ends the game if you manage to kick it. And the format is slow enough that you sometimes will kick it, which means that it can make amazing damage. You will very often have those games when you think that you stabilized, but you're at 9 and you can't live in peace with being at 9 because Fight with Fire is looming above you when the opponent has a couple of mountains on board. Okay, so let's look at the individual colors. I decided not to look at the archetypes because mainly we don't have enough sample size to look at archetypes win rates in sealed specifically. We can have those data from draft, but as I already told you, for example, blue-red as an archetype exists in draft but doesn't exist in sealed that frequently, so it will be hard to compare streamlined Adelies decks from draft with what you will open in your pools. I always arrange the cards in the order of the win rate. So on the left you have cards with the highest win rate, and on the right with the lowest win rate, and these are the top 4 commons, and in the next slide uncommons from each color. And in white, you have a mixture of removal and creatures. So the top common is Mesa Unicorn. It's 2 mana 2/2 lifelinker. We know from other sets that 2 mana 2/2 lifelinkers are good, but especially in here in Dominaria, when 2-drops in general are relatively poor at the common level, the Mesa Unicorn is just a giant compared to the rest of the 2-drops. The 2/2 lifelinker will allow you to not only be aggressive early on, but also build up a cushion of some life if your deck is a bit slower, so you can have this early drop that will stabilize you for the later game, which is a great combination. And the second most winningest common is Blessed Light. It's a 5 mana exile target creature or enchantment removal at instant speed. And 5 mana is quite a lot for modern standards of limited, but in Dominaria it's just about right. So it actually is a good card. It has a high win rate, and it will do exactly what you want. You want to have access to a couple of unconditional removals when you play sealed, because in sealed people open 6 rares, and and multiple uncommons as well, which can be quite powerful. So being able to deal with that is very useful. And as Mercurio in the chat notices, it's really great to be able to exile in bolas clutches with it. And also, because it's an instant, you can do a sneak during attack exile of on Sarah's wings, and block the creature with something bigger that the opponent didn't expect, and then turn it into a nice 2-for-1. So multiple uses of that card. Number 3 on the list is called the Cavalry. That's a 4-mana sorcery. Create two 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance. Turns out that 2 2/2s with vigilance for 4 mana is just what you need. There are a couple of knight synergies in the set, so the type there is not completely irrelevant. But in general, just 2 bodies for 4 mana is what you want to be doing with this card. And the last one is Gideon's Reproach. That's a 2 mana, deal 4 to target attacking or blocking creatures on instant speed, obviously. And that's another like medium removal, but it's just good enough. And I think that these 4 commons are quite far away from the rest of the white commons, at least in the set. Just double checking it. So yeah, they have like 66 to 64% win rate, and then there is a drop with a Knight of New Benalia, the 2 mana 3/1 vanilla creature at 62.5, and Pegasus Courser, the Pegasus that can give flying to other attacking creatures when it attacks with them. That's around 62. So there's like 2 percentage point difference between the 4 that I'm showing you and the next card. When it comes to uncommons, top one is on Sarah's Wings, and I already mentioned it's a bomb. The win rate of that card is honestly quite insane, 70% game in hand win rate. Yeah, definitely try to build around it if you have it. It's also moderately easy to splash compared to, let's say, in bolas clutches, because it only costs 1 white. Great card. Just make sure that you don't get the blowout by playing it into a removal that is active. So try to maybe wait for your opponent to tap out. Second card on the list, and that's markedly weaker than on Sarah's Wings, is Dauntless Bodyguard. And that's around 66% win rate, so still pretty impressive. And it's a 2/1 to play on turn 1, which is good. But later in the game, it's not a completely dead card because you play it and you choose to protect a very valuable card that you already control. So so it can act as an early aggressor in some games, and it can act as protector in... Wait, it asks itself. Sometimes he attacks, sometimes he protects. So good, diverse creature, good for the early game, good for the late game. We don't, unfortunately, have the data in the opening hand, but it's much better when you draw it earlier, it seems, from the data than when you draw it later. But still, it's not useless when you draw it later, which is very often the case of 1 mana 2/1. Number 3 on the list is the Danita Capashen. 3 mana, first strike, vigilance, lifelink, auras and equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Again, with On Sarah's Wings and other things like that, it's absolutely not a trinket text. Obviously, probably the worst target for On Sarah's Wings, because it basically gives it +1/+1 and flying, as it already has the other abilities that it grants. Still, it's good to have it on a creature without having to risk playing an aura on it. It's a very good early drop. The first strike is very... First strike is a very good ability in this format because there's not so many creatures that can deal with it easily, or at least early. And you have some removal or some combat tricks that can help you push the damage through it with it. And number 4 is Knight of Grace. That's probably the best 2-drop in the format. It's a 2 mana 2/2 first striker with hexproof from black. and it gets +1/+0 as long as any player controls a black permanent. So if you're playing a black and white deck and you have a black permanent on board, it will get 3/2 every time you have that kind of situation. And 3/2 first striker for 2 mana, you can imagine, is great. And especially tricky situations when you play against the decks that are heavy on black. They cannot target it with their removal, so they have to be able to deal with the 3/2 first striker just by blocking, which can be pretty tricky for them. Which other cards are there in the uncommon bracket that I didn't mention? There is a slight indication that Sanctum Spirit may be good, and that's a 3/2 lifelinker. You can discard a historic card and it gets indestructible until end of turn. That's for 4 mana. Small sample size, but it has a decent win rate in that small sample size. So maybe you want a deck that is slightly tuned towards playing Sanctum Spirit. There's also Quende, Pride of Femref. That's a 4 mana 2/2 double striker, but it gives creatures with first strike you control double strike. So if you have multiple first strikers, you might want to try to play it. Okay. My God, it's another. We're having storms with lightning in November. That's a bit weird. Okay, common blue cards. I told you this format is a bit aged in plain view. Yes, it is. You can go to 17 lands. You can choose Dominaria. You can choose Sealed, and then you can do all kinds of sorting in the card performance tab. So all the data that you see here is available on 17 lands. It's not any of those secret data that no one has access to. And most of those seals will be from the last couple of days because there was a return of Dominaria Sealed, so people can practice before the open. But not many people did, so there's not much data. That's a caveat. Luckily, most of this data aligns pretty well with the draft data. So if you were wondering, quite a lot of those cards are also top 4 cards in draft when you compare it. So I told you that this format is a bit aged, so it has cards that used to be powerful in limited, but probably no longer are. And I think that 5 mana 3/4 flyer is a card that fell out of grace in the last 4 years and is not as good. Now you want to have a 4 mana 3/3 flyers. That's where the money is in terms of the flyers, and not even always that. But Cloud Reader Sphinx was a good card in Dominaria, top common, and one of the top commons in draft as well. It also scries 2, so that's probably 2/3 of the card draw, which adds to it. Second common is Academy Journey Mage, and you might expect that it's not as good as in draft, but it's still pretty good because it's still the second best common in the format. It's a 4 mana Manowar, but it is a 3/2, and it can cost 1 less if you control a wizard. Mind you that this reduction in cost comes if you control a wizard, not for each wizard you control. Otherwise, it will be busted. But it potentially can be a 4 mana 3/2 that bounces a card, and that's still good enough. Syncopite is the third best blue common, and just a counter spell for unless an opponent pays X, and it also exiles that spell. And Blink of an Eye, a bounce spell that can draw a card if you kick it, but then it costs 4 mana, is closing up the gap. Don't sleep on the cards that bounce and draw a card, because these are format after format underappreciated by drafters, and 17 land users are benefiting greatly from it because they play it much more higher than the average arena user, and so should you, because they always tend to be good. When it comes to the uncommons, maybe before that I'll double check if there are any special mention worth talking about. There is one weird card in the top blue commons. It's Befuddle. It's an instant. Target creature gets -4/-0 until end of turn and draw a card. It has a very small sample size, but it has a very high win rate. So potentially worth thinking about if you are short on playables and you're playing a more controlling deck than the aggro. And another card was just outside of the top 4 was Divination, 3 mana, draw 2. You should always play it in this format. It's a good card in this format, and don't sleep on that. It just didn't make the top 4, but it was, I think, 0.1% behind Blink of an Eye in terms of the win rate, so really close. And I think it's one of those cards that is actually stronger in Sealed than it is in Draft. When it comes to the uncommons, small sample sizes because not so much blue was played as white. So keep that in mind that those sample sizes are petite. But Inbolas Clutches is head and shoulders above everything. 70% win rate, very much like on Sarah's Wings. Is it 70? Yeah, 70.3 to be precise. Then we have 2 cards that have slightly smaller sample sizes, but probably are worth thinking about. Wizard's Retort, another counter spell. So counter spells seem to be good in Sealed in this format, so use them if you can. Both Syncopate and Wizard Retort. And Tetsuko Omezawa, 2 mana, 1/3 creatures you control with power or toughness 1 or less can't be blocked. So itself, it is a 1/3 unblockable creature, and it will give unblockability to all your 1Xs and X1s. And lastly, Time of Ice, a saga. Keep in mind, Dominaria was the place where sagas were born. First 2 chapters are tap creature an opponent controls, and it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, as long as it controls the Time of Ice. And then at chapter 3, return all those tapped creatures to their owner's hands and forcing them to replay. It's a back-breaking tempo play that sets the opponent back for a long time. You either manage to survive because you play it by tapping up their biggest threats and then forcing the opponent to replay them, or you can use it to push your damage through by removing some blockers from the equation and clearing the path for your creatures. Okay, black. The top common in black, according to the win rate, is Fungal Infection. That's a 1 mana instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Create a 1/1 green sapling creature token. It's really a great way of dealing with a 2-drop for 1 mana. Late game, you will force trades or win combats using that. So it's like sort of semi-removal spell, and also you end up with this 1/1 green sapling creature token that has some synergies with other cards in green and black. It's awful outside, but okay. And that one has 62.8% win rate, so not terrible for a common at all. Second place is Eviscerate. That's a 4 mana sorcery. Just says destroy target creature for 4. It's just good. If the 5 mana white one at instant speed was good, this one is probably comparable. It doesn't exile, but costs 1 less. It doesn't deal with enchantments, but costs 1 less. It's not an instant, and it costs 1 less. 1 less is always a good value. So play any number of copies of that if you play black. There's 1 creature, Talid Omnivore. That's a 4 mana 3/3. You can sacrifice a creature for 1 mana. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And if you sacrifice a sapling this way, you also gain 2 life. So that's like a late game threat. If you're going slightly wider, there are several spells that will create multiple saplings, which allows you to not only present lethal multiple times, but also have a nice life cushion when you play it. It's clearly the best common creature, but best black common creature, and around 60% win rate. And the last card is Vicious Offering, and that's 2 mana, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. But if you kick it by sacrificing a creature, that creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn instead. And that is also very well synergizing with the token makers. For 2 mana, you can deal with a sizable threats. I mean, when we looked at the bombs that you have in this format, it dealt with multiple of them just for 2 mana. If you have a couple of the For example, 1/1 Saprolinks from Fungal Infection that you played before. So yeah. Are there any cards worth mentioning in there? There is Caligo Skin Witch. That's a 2 mana for a vanilla 1/3. Or you can kick it, and then you pay 6 mana, including 2 black. And then when it enters the battlefield, if it was kick, each opponent discards 2 cards. And this format is slow enough that the 6 mana 1/3 that discards 2 cards will be useful on multiple occasions. So it's not a waste of a card at all. You should be able to play it, and it has good stats at 59.8% win rate. It's not far from Vicious Offering in terms of its win rate. So don't sleep on the Caligo Witch. Play it. In terms of uncommons, the top uncommon is Eldest Reborn, another saga. It is markedly lower than Bolas's Clutches and On Sarah's Wings. Still pretty good though. The first chapter, each opponent sacrifices a creature. You can, play it around in such a way that you actually snag a really good target from it. Then each opponent discards a card. Again, in this format, late discard can hit something really useful if they don't play around it. And sometimes by playing around it, they will also lose tempo because they will keep something in their hand because they want to protect their bomb. And third chapter is you put target creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield. And that means that you can also get the thing that, for example, your opponent had to sacrifice from the first chapter if you don't have anything yourself. Then we have Cast Down, destroy target non-legendary creature at instant for 2. Really good removal, doesn't deal with everything, quite easy. Settle the Score, 4 mana sorcery, exile target creature, put 2 loyalty counters on the planeswalker you control. I mean, if you put loyalty counters on a planeswalker you control, you're probably in a good situation because planeswalkers in this format are quite good. But even without putting the loyalty counters, it's just a solid removal, although a bit heavy on the black as it costs 2 black to cast, but enough to be in the top 4 of the uncommons. And the last is the black equivalent of the Knight of Grace, the Knight of Malice. 2 mana, first strike, Hexproof from white, and it gets +1/+0 as long as the player controls a white permanent. Perfectly, you start your black and white deck. You play one of them on turn 2 and the other one on turn 3 and swing for 3 with first strike. And few people will come back from that kind of an opening. Are there any other interesting uncommons with high win rates? Not really. There is Whisper, 4 mana 2/2. You can sacrifice 2 creature and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. There is Urugos, the empty one, 6 mana 4/3 flyer. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card at random. If that player can't, you draw a card. But these are much lower on the win rate scale and also have smaller sample sizes. So not as good as the top 4. Top 4 is markedly better than anything else. Okay, red, as I mentioned, is the weakest color, and you see it instantly in the win rates. So Shivan Fire is probably the best common that there is in red. It has roughly 60% win rate. The other 3 are at around 58, so it's 59.5 roughly for the Shivan Fire and 58 roughly for the other 3. Also much smaller sample sizes for the other 3. And we have Shivan Fire is just a removal. It's a shock that you can kick to make a deal 4. Keldon Overseer, 3 mana, 3/1 with haste, but you can kick it, and when you do, you also steal a creature for a turn. So can be a very good card as a sort of top end in an aggressive deck. There's Run Amok. That's a 2 mana. A target attacking creature gets +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. Combat Trick. Sometimes you will open a deck where you don't have bombs. you don't have a coherent to color deck, and maybe you'll have a couple of Ranamogs, you can think about making an aggro of some sorts, because Ranamogs push quite a lot of damage, and you can go under those bomb-laden decks. But it's a risky strategy. You really need to have nothing else to do to in desperation reach for that kind of strategy. And G2 Journey Mage is sort of in the same gist. It's a 3-mana 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another wizard, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So you probably want to play it again in one of those decks together with Ranamok, some other wizards, if your pool allows you to play that kind of deck. And just to show you how bad red is in the sealed format, there was not even 4 uncommons that have enough data to give them a win rate. However, these 3 are actually pretty good. Fight with Fire is approaching 70% win rate. So it's really strong. Oh, wait, is it? No, it's only approaching 59% win rate. Blah. So approaching 60% win rate. Not impressive at all. It has an insanely higher win rate in draft than in sealed. And Goblin Barrage and Wizard Lightning, all of them are removal spells. All of them are easily splashable. So think about them more in that aspect. I would still semi-hard avoid playing red. But yeah, all of them solid removal spells, and that's all that can be said. But if you look at it, when we go back through all the colors, 2 removals in white, blue, well, doesn't have removal, it has Bolas Clutches, but the black has Fungal Infection, Eviscerate, Vicious Offering, Eldest Reborn, Cast Down, and Settle Discord, so sort of 6 removal in the top 8 commons. Here we have Shivan Fire and 3 uncommon ones, so 4 out of 7 cards in red. This format, really, you need to value removal. It has much higher win rate than anything else. Green is a different animal altogether. The one common that is head and shoulders above everything else, Yavimaya Sapherd. That's a 3-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1. So very much like the Argivian Cavalry from Dominaria United. 2/2 that brings up a 1/1. This one doesn't have any additional abilities, but it's still good enough to make it the best green common by quite far. Grow from Ashes is a card that is not good in Dominaria Draft, but it has actually a very good win rate in sealed, because it's one of the few cards that allow you to splash colors. It's a 3-mana search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, and with the kicker you can do it for 2 lands. So for 5 mana you ramp into 7 mana, which can be useful in some situations. But yeah, Grow from Ashes allows you to fix and ramp, and that's, I guess, what green wants to be doing in this format in general. So for example, you have Ballad Gorger, 4-mana 4/4, but if you kick it for 8, it becomes a 7/7. It's a big and dumb 7/7, but that might be just enough for you to win the game. Also, something to ramp is Supperling Migration. It's a 2-mana, create 2 1/1s, but if you kick, you make 4 of those tokens. So for 6 mana, you can make 4 1/1s, which will synergize with some other cards in the set that either boost the Sapperlings or let you sacrifice Sapperlings, or give +1/+1 to all the creatures that you control. So yeah, worth playing. These 4 are, if I remember correctly, are quite far away from any other common in this color. Oh no, actually there is one common that is actually has a high win rate, but very small sample size. That's why I skipped it. It's Gift of Growth, 2 mana, target creature untaps and gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And if it was kicked for 2, so for 4 mana, it becomes a 4/4/4. So the untap sort of ambush combat trick with a small sample size, but a high win rate from that small sample size. And in terms of uncommons, again, we see the same theme. Again, we see relatively small sample sizes. but we see things that you want to ramp into. In Grun, the Lonely King, 6 mana 5/5, that if attacks alone doubles its power, and also can be kicked for 3 extra to make it a 10/10. So basically, if it attacks alone, it can swing for direct lethal. A big dumb beast, but again, this format, if your opponents don't have removal, can win with those big dumb beasts. Untamed Kavu. This is a versatile card. It's a 2 mana 2/2 with Vigilance and Trample. But if you kick it for 3 extra mana, so for 5 mana, it becomes a 5/5 with Vigilance and Trample, which is just great. So you definitely want to play any number of those because good early, good late. And they are slightly one level above the big dumb beasts. Thorn Elemental, 7 mana 7/7, and it can deal damage as though it weren't blocked. So basically, unblockable source of at least 7 damage if they don't manage to kill it, and even more. So this can be a 3-turn clock if your opponent doesn't have a way of dealing with it. And dealing with it requires either a spell or multiple blocking. So if they don't have a removal, that's going to be a 2/1 or a 3/1. Yeah. And last one is Song of Freyalise, another saga. Interesting ability in the first chapters that until their next turn, creatures you control gain tap add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And if you go wide, this can be backbreaking when you play it on turn 4 or something, and you have already like 4 Saprolings. You play it on turn 4. Those Saprolings can then start casting creatures. The creatures also will be able to cast new creatures next turn. It also fixes your mana. And at the end of chapter 3, all your creatures get a +1/+1 counter and gain Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible until end of turn. So you can actually mini overrun swing scot-free because nothing will die in that attack from your side. And the Trample will probably take care of some damage and will force opponent to trade. This is very similar to the Weatherseed Treaty from the current set, as it only probably promotes going wide a bit more than the Weatherseed Treaty did. Okay. Okay, before I go on honorable mentions, I will look if there are any other green uncommons that maybe are worth mentioning. Fungal Plots, that's the one that has actually the highest win rate of all the green uncommons, but has a very small sample size, so I didn't talk about it. But it's an enchantment. At 2 mana, you can exile a creature card from your graveyard, create a 1/1 Saproling creature token. You can sacrifice 2 Saprolings, and you gain 2 life and draw a card. So a sort of engine for the late game decks. There is actually quite wide variety of green uncommons that do something. There is also Wide Onslaught. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and if you kick it, you put 2 instead. There's an Elfheim Druid, mana dork for 2 mana, but that can give you 2 mana to spend on kicked spells, and you have a couple of those kicker spells that you might want to ramp into. Spore Swarm for 4 mana, create 3 1/1 Saprolings at instant speed. All these cards are decent. One worth mentioning maybe is a Spore Crown Talent, the sort of Fungus Lord. It gives funguses and Saprolings +1/+1 and when it's in play, and it's a 2 mana 2/2 itself. In some decks, when you have enough synergy, that's going to be a great card. In some decks where you have not enough synergy, it's going to be way too frequently a 2 mana 2/2 vanilla, which is something you don't want to play. So you have to think about when to put it in your deck. Preferably when you have those Spore Swarms, when you have the Saproling Migration, then you also want to play your Talent, or when you have multiple Yavimaya Sapherds, for example. And that's the end of the cards, colored cards, but there are a couple of honorable mentions that are not in any color. And number 1 of them is Skittering Surveyor. I don't know, I mean, if you didn't play Dominaria, this card might seem like not so great, but it was great in that format. It's a 3 mana artifact creature, a 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic card. It allows you to fix your colors. It allows you to draw lands if you're playing more expensive spells, and the body will probably chump something at some stage. It also stops the saprolings from swarming over you by killing them one by one if your opponent chooses to attack you with it. So a card definitely worth playing. 62.8% win rate. Icy Manipulator, similar win rate as Skittering Surveyor. 4 mana artifact. For 1 mana, I can tap target artifact, creature, or land. So it's basically 1 mana tapper that is hard to get rid of, but also can tap lands if you want to switch off a particular card that you're afraid in game 3. You can do it with Icy Manipulator. And Memorial to Genius. Dominaria doesn't have a cycle of common 2-color lands. Instead of that, they have a cycle of single-colored utility lands, memorials, all of them. They enter the battlefield tapped. They give mana of their color, and they have an ability for some mana in sacrificing it. And a Memorial to Genius has an ability to pay 5, sacrifice it, and draw 2 cards. This card has a very high win rate, I think 66% or something. And you should play it every time you play blue, basically, because in the late game, this is the thing that will push you through the line when you attrition your opponent in some kind of a blue-black deck. You kill all their stuff, you sacrifice Memorial to Genius, you grow some spells, you draw some spells, and that will let you to win the game. Okay, now a couple of traps. Number 1, Soul Salvage. It looks like this is going to be the card for that kind of format because it's slow, but turns out it has a very bad win rate. So I'm not going to say that you shouldn't put it in your deck. I'm just going to say that you should think carefully whether you want to put it in your deck or not. I think that is because very often you will just get poor targets from it because your graveyard will be filled with stuff that is just not that impactful, and it's got a very, very bad win rate when you have it in your opening hand, because you basically start with a quasi mulligan in this piece that this format operates with. Second card, Ancient Animus. That's a 2 mana instant, and target creature fights. If it's a legendary, it gets +1/+1 on top of that. Just doesn't do as much as you probably would want it to do. It's too expensive for the effect it does. And not always you will be able to get that +1/+1 bonus. So compare it with the Tail Swipe in Dominaria United that you can play it on any creature for 1 mana, and if you play it in your main step, that creature gets +1/+1. You can always find a situation when you get an extra bonus from +1/+1, and because of that, that card is great. This one, because of the occasional character of the +1/+1 bonus, makes it much worse. Unless you play 5-6 legends, then the card will become good. And Semi's Trap and Slimefoot the Stowaway. I know that lots of people are crazy about this card. It already appeared in the chat, but it actually has pretty poor numbers in 17 Lands sealed data. So when I look at the uncommon cards, all the other uncommons that have some data are going between 69 and 62% win rate, game in hand win rate, and Slimefoot the Stowaway has only 57.1. I don't think that just making the 1/1 is impactful enough for 4 mana, and there is not enough of additional Saproling synergies to play it in any deck. I think that there will be deck where it's going to be excellent, but I think that people put it in decks where it's not excellent, because without the additional Saproling synergies, it's not that good. So these are sort of semi-traps, I would say. Unfortunately, we don't have big enough sample sizes to look at maybe more niche cards that people play as traps, but these are the 3 that stroke me I should mention in this segment. Okay, let's go to trophy decks. I picked a couple of trophy decks just to show you how they look like. I picked a couple of 2-color ones. I picked a couple of multicolor ones, and these were all from the last week trophies. You can see this is a blue-white deck. It does have not really bombs. It has some solid creatures, but it has an alternative plan that is available to blue decks in this format, and that is Cold Water Snapper, the 6 mana 4/5 hexproof creature, and Arcane Flight, the 1 mana enchantment that gives +1/+1 and flying to a creature. Um, with a 5/6 hexproof flyer, you are going to win quite some few games. So this is a small package that you might think about. On top of that, it has a couple of good 2-drops in Knights of New Benalia and Mesa Unicorn, 2 Blink of an Eyes for some tempo play, Sergeant at Arms that can generate additional creatures. It even has Dub, which is not such a great card, but it worked in this particular version. Juggernaut, with a couple of ways of giving it first strike, might not be bad. I think that's why the Dub and Jousting Lens are in this deck. And Sarah Angel, another way of finishing the games. But you can see, not many, not any, no any. It doesn't have any bombs, but still it managed to go 7-0, I think, easily. It doesn't even have that great removal. It has Blood Tallow Candle, which is an artifact that you can sacrifice for an atrocious amount of mana to give -5/-5 to something. And it has a couple of blinks and Time of Ice, but not really anything that you can deal with. Oh, it has Deep Freeze. But it doesn't have like a super good removal package. It doesn't have a super good early game creature package. It probably just survives long enough to play the Snapper and finish the games like that. And Lance and the Cold Snapper is also an atrocious combination because it becomes a 6/5 first striker with hexproof. So yeah, hard to deal with that. Okay, the second deck is white-black. This one, 3 Sarah Angels. Must be nice. On top of that, it has a couple of bombs. Benalish Marshal, which is a bomb that is hard to cast. It costs 3 white, but still gives +1/+1 to all your creatures and is a 3/3 on its own. And History of Benalia, which makes a couple of the 2/2 knights and gives all the knights +2/+1 until end of turn and the third chapter. Unanswered, this can create awful scenarios for the opponent. Also has 2 knights, the Knight of Grace and Knight of Malice, 2 Mesa Unicorns, 2 Adamant Wills. So this deck will be super good in starting off the blocks very aggressively with really good 2-drops. You can't dream of a better 2-drop package. Has a couple of Vicious Offering that can remove the blockers and push you through. And if you get to the late game, it can finish off with those 3 Sarah Angels quite easily. I don't know, it maybe even has not enough planes. Maybe it could have played 1 more planes in this package. Because currently it's at 10-7, maybe 11-6 would be even playable. If you want to play the Benalish Marshal. But nonetheless, the deck trophied. I think Adamant Will in this particular deck is going to be really good. Putting this extra +1/+2 on the Knight of Grace or on the Knight of Malice is phenomenal. And this is something that you probably would be happy to open. Just to show you that you can also trophy with red, there's a white-red deck. Pretty strange. This is a deck that clearly was carried by a couple of really strong bombs. It has some okay 2-drops. It has a Mesa Unicorn, Knight of New Benalia. It has the Shivan Fire as a removal, Seal Away, which is not such a great removal in an aggressive deck, but clearly it worked for the person that was operating this deck. 2 Pegasus Coursers that allow you to, your 2-drops to attack with flying later in the game. Wizard's Lightning as another removal, but then at the top of the mana curve, it has Shalai, Voice of Plenty, Verig's Bladewing, Helm of the Host, On Sarah's Wings. These 4 cards probably just carried this deck quite well because all of them are super powerful. Interesting Tech and Fall of the Throne, which is an Armageddon for 6 mana, but those lands start coming back on chapters 2 and 4. But maybe this deck could build enough advantage to Armageddon and push through some damage before the opponent rebuilds. Okay. Just to show you that everything is possible, I also found a red-green deck that trophied. But again, we see Varric's Bladewing as a card in that particular deck. It also has 3 Spore Swarms, 2 Saproling Migrations, and Song of Frail Eyes on top of that, and Yamivaya Shepherd. This deck would probably love the Fungus Lord, but it didn't get one. Still, it managed to trophy. It has Steel Leaf Champion, the 3 mana 5/4 that can be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Has a bunch of cards that you can kick late in the game, in Ballot Gorger, in Varric's, and in Saproling Migrations, and Untamed Kavu. So it does have ability to stay longer and get those cards that can be cheap also into some late game level. I think Song of Frail Eyes is great in this deck. If you play several Saproling Migrations, then you can cast another Saproling Migration using your Saprolings that can tap for mana now. It has Fungal Plots as another way of creating those Saprolings, and hopefully it can win just by going super wide and dealing enough damage through that last chapter of Song of Frail Eyes. And if not, you still have Varric's Bladewing that can finish the game quite easily. So you can trophy with a red-green deck. So even if you are sad that you didn't open the magnificent pool of Esper cards, you can still manage to get your 7 Ws. And here we have a deck that has a bit of everything. It's basically a white-green aggro. Again, with the Dauntless Bodyguard, 2 Benalish Honor Guard, some Llanowar Elves, Shanna, Sisei's Legacy, that's a go white sort of legend, Song of Frail Eyes, and then it starts becoming a bit weirder. It just splashes 1 Eviscerate, it splashes a couple of legendary creatures like Wrath Capashen and Arvad the Cursed. It has Weatherlight on top of everything, another splashed legend. So that person definitely went for it. And the splashes are of 3 basic lands, 1 of each color of the splashed things. Skittering Surveyor. And what else is there? There's the Song of Frail Eyes that can give you mana of any color. And that's basically it. So not much of the tools to get. There's the Llanowar Envoy, I think, can fix mana. So yeah, that's expensive fixing, as Mercurio says. But the deck made it. Probably, like a good combination of having an early game and then having late game with the couple of bombs that they had was just enough, and it worked. So it can be done. I think that Shanna, Sisei's Legacy, is a particularly strong card in that sealed format. It had really good numbers in terms of the win rate, even if the sample size was on the smaller side. But I think it had 68% win rate or something. And when you think about it, it is sort of 2-color pile, because 1 red card, 2 black cards, and 1 blue card. So most of it is actually white-green, straightforward. There are some functionalities added through splashing. This is a much sweeter 4-color deck. 2 Caligo Witches, Knight of Malice, Saproling Migration, and Fungal Plots for the early game. 4 Eviscerates, because why wouldn't you? 2 Spore Swarms, and then Slimefoot the Stowaway is great in that deck, because you have Fungal Plots, Saproling Migrations, Spore Swarms. Then it becomes an engine. It has great fixing in 2 Grow from the Ashes, so that's enough to splash your to get your splashed lands. It has a couple of bombs in Shalai, Voice of Plenty, Territorial Allosaurus, Time of Ice to buy you time, Academic Journey Mages to buy you time, and in Bolas Clutches as another of those uncommon bombs. Now this is a kind of a deck that and the Skittering Surveyor for splashing, of course. This is the kind of a pool that I honestly wish you to open in the open. Open in the open. There we go. It looks sweet, even though it's 3 colors, of 4 colors actually with Shalai. It's, I think, easily playable. And yeah, it looks absolutely powerful, and it can deal with all the bombs from the opponent because eviscerates are there to protect you. So you should be all good. Yeah, this would be a pretty good draft deck, and this is a sealed deck. So there you go. And Territorial Allosaurus and Shalai are one of the better bombs in the format. They didn't make into my top 6, but they are not far off. And Bolas Clashes is, of course, very powerful. And here, Slimefoot, the Stowaway, gets really the boost of all the synergies. You will win with the late game decks by keeping the Caligo Skin Witch, which you can actually ramp into very early. So you can probably play it on turn 5. And yeah, looks sweet. That was the last one that I had selected from my trophy decks. And all I can do right now is just wish you all the best of luck in the Open on the weekend. And before I go, I would like to thank 17 Lands because they work tirelessly to give us, the players, the data, and let us, get a more informed way of analyzing how draft works. So thanks to Viral Misnomer and ZTM, who are working most actively right now. Also thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is helping me with releasing the podcast. By the way, I dumped like 2 episodes into the podcast in the last couple of days because I was a bit busy with work and neglected giving you your weekly portion of the magic numbers. But hopefully the worst is behind me, and I can start preparing for Brothers War. I would like to thank mtgazone.com for sponsoring me. By the way, next week we are going to have, if you like my content, then you're going to have my content, because on Monday I'm going to have Florida Man to visit me for the Dominaria United goodbye show. And always as a goodbye show, I look at individual data from a person. So I'm going to look at the Florida Man's data and how he was dealing with Dominaria United. We're going to look at all the cards that he drafted the most, which cards had the highest win rate when he played them, which cards he played too often because they didn't have a high win rate, but he still tried to play them and stuff like that. And on Tuesday, swap to Brothers War, and we're going to have the draft archetypes, the skeleton, draft skeleton decks with me, Sander Kirstens, Jason ILTG, and Jordan. So Stellar Cast and me, we're going to stream our first impression of the format before we actually get to play it. So you're cordially invited to see those. Also, I'd like to thank Esescu and Mana Junkie, who are making the music for the podcast version of this stream. And with that, I'll see you next week.